So what we're going to do is we've got 4 presentations, but they're shorter presentations because we're then going to go into the roundtable format. So we will hear from each speaker for about 10 minutes, and then we'll go into questions and answers, but also debate. We have some pre-prepared questions, but we're also very much open to basically having a broader discussion with everyone in the room, in person and online. Emma, I was just going to go straight into it, but do you want to say anything about the study group or the panel, or introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, so I'm Emma Tomalin, Professor of Religion and Public Life at the University of Leeds. We had our first panels yesterday. I think we've been now having panels in the Development Studies Association probably for about 8 or 9 years, so quite some time now. We normally have a study group meeting, but in fact it happened before our panels this year, so we hadn't had a chance to invite people and to sort of warm people up and encourage them to come. So unfortunately, you turned up, Olivia, didn't you? Unfortunately, it wasn't in my diary either. Did anyone else come?
Annika did as well.
Yeah. Annika did as well. Okay. So we'll try and be a bit more organised with that that next year. But yeah, I don't want to say too much more. I'll hand back to Olivia to kick things off.
Okay, great. So I will go first, basically, to start us off, if that's okay with all the panelists. And we have Matthew in the room, and then Annika and Selena online as well. I think that what I'm going to suggest is if I start, then we'll hand over to Annika, then hand over to Matthew, and then Selena, if you're okay to go forth. Does that sound okay to everyone? Okay. Okay, I will share my screen. Oh, tech support, can we have screen share made available?
Yes, definitely. All right, try that, see if it works. All right.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. So this presentation, or this short kind of introduction, is to really get the panel going and thinking about where we're at in terms of the state of the evidence in religions and development research. And this comes out of an article that I had published in the Review of Faith and International Affairs last year. And the title of the presentation is the same as the title of the article. But yes, just to say, I have been working in this area probably for about 12 years now, and I work in, as I said, this group called the Joint Learning Initiative, which puts me in this real bridging position between research and practice, and research and policy as well. And, you know, previously I was working on, for example, secularization or secular perspectives in the humanitarian system, post-secular perspectives, maybe a little bit more of the kind of theoretical approach. But then in the last few years, I've got really practical, you know, how is evidence being understood, for example, amongst development NGOs, or UN agencies, and how can we make it work for the practical decisions they need to make? This article kind of came out of some of my frustration with the arguments that were being made and the discussions that were being had about the evidence, the research in religions and development. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm proposing there's 2 slides only, and we have a before and after almost. So this first slide is the before, or somewhat current state of the arguments, and then what I'll spend more time on is the second slide, which is the after, or what I propose is the future, and kind of where we're going with debates in our field overall. So in the religions and development discussions, I believe that we've had 3 main kind of arms of argumentation that I'm contending are somewhat tired now, or at least very well rehearsed. They're not incorrect in some ways, but I think it would broaden our debate to move beyond them. So just to quickly summarize what these are, of course, we see the claim and assumption common across all authors is that religious beliefs and practices should matter to humanitarian development and peace work, that kind of humanitarian development and peace nexus. There is not a particular theoretical framing behind this. In fact, I often find that it's really argued in the negative almost. It's that attention to faith matters because it has been previously ignored. So this leads this sub point, religions matter, but they are often ignored and sidelined. And so from the beginning of the religions and development publications, right back from kind of the where we might see as the earliest publications in the 80s, the argument has been made that religions have been really ignored and put to one side in much of the development debate, since we got to, let's say, these periods of development, say from post-World War II onwards. And of course, the major argument to why this happens is because Western secular perspectives have marginalized religious beliefs and practices as a matter of importance. And then we have another observation, though, that in recent times, there has been a resurgence or a turn to religion amongst development actors, but this surge of interest then often leads to instrumentalization. So instrumentalization has become one of these absolutely key terms for all religions and development articles. I mean, I've definitely used it many times myself. And that's the idea that development actors will co-opt religious resources for development purposes. But given the asymmetries of power that exist, this means that the faith actors are, inferior to the development superior actors. And so therefore you have the use and abuse of religious assets. And then, of course, there's been this significant project of defining what is a faith-based organization. I actually mostly use the term faith actors now to give us a broader spectrum of discussion about who might be in that umbrella of faith actors. And then, recently there's been a bit more of a turn to discussion of local faith actors, local faith-based organizations, smaller, national, local, grassroots, rather than just a focus, as there was maybe more initially in the field, on the large international faith-based organizations. Okay, so I'm assuming that actually a lot of people knew many of those arguments already, because we're all engaged in this field or interested in this religion and development research somewhat. So what I'm proposing is different, and I think this is where the interest lies, really. Firstly, that we don't just come from the religions matter argument, and we instead argue that religions are complex, because the religions matter argument phrasing really starts any debate on the back foot by having to argue that religions even matter at all. Instead, a basic recognition that religions are complex immediately broadens the conversation and aligns more with the conceptual basis that we can see from, say, religious studies and ideas such as lived religion, that pushes scholars to engage with the daily realities of how people practice their religions, or concepts like religious literacy, which ask us not to oversimplify our understanding of religious beliefs and practices, but instead engage with how these beliefs and practices are always changing, very diverse, and contextually embedded, importantly. And so why is this important for the future of our debate? It's because over many years, I've really seen many conferences putting, and certainly debates with development agencies in various forms, always asking this question of what is the added value of religion to development? And I think that that is the question that's not helpful for us, because that is really putting you in the position where you have this burden of proof of having to say that religion matters. And instead, we should work from a more assured position where we know, we're research is very confident, really, that religious presence is undeniable in the development sector in various ways, and we can start to make more nuanced positions about how religions are contextually and changeably part of this broad spectrum of development, from the positive to the negative effects and everything in between. So we don't want to put ourselves in this position of having this burden of proof placed on the research in this field, but instead an invitation to describe complexity and nuance. And we open up the research to a more honest engagement with the full spectrum of religiousness in development. And again, not having to force ourselves, the field has been criticized as forcing itself in the position of, if we're always trying to prove the added value of religion to development, then we're always putting forward the positive arguments rather than engaging with the problems fully as well. And that has sometimes been the takeaway that, say, the policymakers and practitioners have had from the presentation of religions and development research, which is not the really what researchers are arguing, but it's come across that way. So third, I think this, or is this the third point? Well, the next point anyway, this also draws us away from the religion is ignored argument to understand how and when religious aspects are included in development all the time, really. And in different contexts, they have been really integrated in many different ways from over decades. So religion is ignored is a relevant argument in some contexts, commonly Western European contexts, and where headquarters are centered, for example. But it's really not a relevant argument in some other places. So recent research has shown that bias against the religious beliefs and practices is more centered with maybe Western European staff. But if you're talking to, for example, staff working in their country of origin, it's a very different understanding of how those secular and religious dynamics are playing out. I think this moves us towards just a place where we can hopefully more confidently engage with the range and regularity of religious engagements happening in development overall, and move us away from the instrumentalization critique as like the only and main and dominant line of critique as well. So we need to, of course, analyze all the power dynamics at play, of which instrumentalization is one. But we've also seen, for example, Emma has written on how religious actors play the game and sometimes allow themselves to be instrumentalized. Or the Creed project from Sussex, from IDS, has really demonstrated that we need to understand the marginalization of some religious minorities, meaning that instrumentalization will affect some more than others. So we need to get at these nuances around some of the dominant arguments that we've seen before. Then I think that another aspect is definitely their analysis through decolonial and then localization trends. And again, like understanding marginalization and intersecting marginalizations allows us to apply an intersectional lens. And people have been doing this and working on this, of course, but I think that it's really more, say, in the last couple of years that we've seen these shifts more and more, and this is what we need to lean into more and more overall, and link with some of the other other researchers working on these debates in other areas too. And so then finally, I've added this next area, which is the need for applied research in religions and development. you know, this is just to acknowledge that we do have this research to policy and practice link that's just very, very obvious in our field because of how much of the research is done with and for NGOs, development agencies, and how that should then make us reflect on our position as researchers, and the ways that we present our research as well. I think I've spoken for about 12 minutes, which is already over the 10, so that's not setting a very good model for everyone else. I apologize. But yes, I will now hand over to, who did I say? Did I say Annika? Next.
You did.
Okay, hand over.
I'll try and share my screen. Yeah, no, thanks so much, Olivia. And I think my presentation follows on well from yours. How do I can you see the screen? Or is that not working
Yes,
yet?
we can see it.
Okay.
And yeah, if you press right at the bottom, the little presentation button, we can go full screen. Or the slideshow at the slideshow button.
That'll work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that work? Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so I suppose I'll just I'll put my timer on. Okay. So yeah, to introduce myself briefly, I'm Annika Newman. I'm a senior research fellow at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies at the University of Ghent in Belgium, although I am British originally. And yeah, like Olivia, I think I've been working in this field sort of for around the same length of time, so around 12 years. So I did my PhD in the north of Senegal, which is a majority Muslim context, and I was looking at educational decision-making and, you know, parents' preferences for their children's schooling and youth's educational trajectories. And at the same time as doing that, so that's kind of my academic hat. And then I've also worked as a practitioner in the field more broadly of gender and development. So working on girls' access to schooling, child marriage, female genital cutting, this kind of constellation of issues that is often problematic in the Sahel region. And over that, you know, throughout those experiences, I regularly come across the kind of tensions I think that you're alluding to, Olivia, you know, between ontological differences between communities and maybe the people who study communities and who design programs and policies. Broadly, that's kind of a bit of a problem. And I'm writing a monograph for Routledge in their Education, Poverty and Development series, which is about the education decision-making in Senegal again. And I'm trying to argue that not only are development policies very much informed by sort of secular biases and other Eurocentric biases, but also the academic theories that are commonly used to understand educational preferences and decision-making, whether that's human capital theory used in economics or a framework using Bourdieu and capital in the social sciences, they also reflect secular biases in various ways. So I'm trying to challenge not only, you know, development program and policy, but also academic research on religions and development from a kind of decolonial perspective. So yeah, I wanted to rebound on your article, Olivia. So I really liked where you say that you feel that there is a bit of a saturation point, you know, the same kinds of arguments are being repeated sort of over the course of the last decade or so. I totally agree with that. I'm going to try and skip over what I was going to say here because I don't want to repeat too much of what you've already said. But for instance, Ben Jones and Maria Yule-Peterson already said sort of over 10 years ago that a lot of the research in the field is instrumental, narrow, or normative. So you've already explained instrumental. Narrow, they said there's a lot of focus on faith-based organizations. I would say there is still quite a narrow, there can be a narrow focus on the sort of visible manifestations of religion. So religious institutions, the authority figures within those institutions, behaviors, rituals, practices, discourses, which kind of eclipses people's ontological perspectives and reasoning and feeling the world through those perspectives. And this focus on the visible manifestations of religion is characteristic of the social scientific study of religion more generally. It's not just something specific to religions and development. So I would agree with that, that's still an issue. And normative is, again, this idea that religions or religious phenomena are studied or judged from a secular standpoint and value framework. So I would agree, and I think, yeah, this definitely dovetails with what you've said. And again, I would agree that part of this issue is that, you know, the subfield is very much influenced by the fact that often we're doing research where we're being paid by donors and organizations to produce knowledge that is directly applicable to whatever problem they are trying to solve. And we're a very diverse community. So of academics who might be, you know, have more academic funding, people who are very oriented towards practice, and people who are kind of straddling the two. I would consider myself to be sort of straddling the two. And I'm going to try and put forward a few recommendations of where I think we could perhaps go to shake things up a bit, but that are relevant to like the different kinds of people in our community. Do my best. So the first is sort of maybe ideas for the academic study of religion. So yeah, I've been engaging a lot with decolonial scholars of religion. So these are people who are more maybe philosophers of religion or yeah, in religious studies departments, not so much religions and development, but what they're saying is obviously directly applicable to us. And yeah, they've argued that this binary between secular and religious, as you mentioned, Olivia, can be it's a constructed binary, but that is reinforced constantly within our practices and our language, that it's possible to distinguish between secular organizations or a secular field and religious phenomena, religious organizations and religious field. And I think, Emma, you've problematized this dichotomy in relation to faith-based organizations, I think, pointing out how actually, what do we even mean by secular and religious? And, you know, you can try and put certain organizations in one group or one category in the other, but actually when you really look at how things work in practice, it dissolves, or it's, you know, this is a constructed binary. But I think we could be pushing that kind of analysis in other fields. And I want to make this idea that even the way that we frame this subfield kind of risks reproducing this idea that there is a secular and a religious by calling the field religions and development. So I prefer to talk about ontologies of / and development, because I think that places, I mean, you can say, oh, it's just language, and language is largely symbolic, but I think there is a bit of a kind of a shift there, like a conceptual shift, that you're, in the religions and development framing, you're kind of placing religions under the microscope, and you're leaving the unmarked, invisible other of secularism kind of outside of the frame. So ontologies of and development is potentially opening the space to consider different ontologies in more equal terms, and looking at the diversity of perspectives. Because within secular, you know, there are so many different ways of being secular, and that manifests in different ways, and really unpacking how that works, and not just in institutional settings. So yeah, I'd like to unpack this a bit more, but I will try and do that later. Yes, okay, that was that slide. That's the ontologies of development. The other point I wanted to make is about the way we do research on religions and development. And this is a field where I don't feel there's been that much discussion. So there seems to be an assumption within the field that the people, or us, researching religions and development hail from a different kind of ontological or epistemological community to the people that we're studying. And there's not that much discussion of positionality within methodological discussions. There's not that much discussion of methodology already within the subfield necessarily, but I don't feel that there's that much stuff on positionality within this. But this could just reflect what I've read. But so I'd be happy to hear of other examples. But I feel like we often talk about our sociological positionality. So how my gender affected my research in a Muslim community, or how, you know, my socioeconomic class or whatever, or my race. But a real interrogation of our ontological and epistemological positioning, I don't feel that there's that much of that. And really delving into how we could be aware of those things. And again, you know, I'll try and go into this a bit later, but often we are only aware of our ontological positioning or epistemological positioning in moments of conflict. So when we're disagreeing with people, and it can be really effective, it can be really experienced on an embodied level. So feelings of sort of disgust or just incomprehension, or, you know, things like this. And I think we could be reflecting on these moments in a more productive way. And I included this piece, this is a piece of art that I did it was a zine workshop on my university about a year ago. So it's part of a bigger conference on the relationship between art and social sciences. And this was a zine workshop where we were invited to produce like a little booklet page, a few pages of art. We just had 2 days with the photocopier, whatever documents or objects we wanted to bring, some glue sticks and some scissors, and on the broad theme of our research journey. So it could be PhD, postdoc, whatever. And I explored the evolution of my own ontological and epistemological perspective during my PhD in the north of Senegal, and kind of my journey from what Christian anthropologist called Jamie Barnes has called the realm of non-belief to the realm of belief, and how that happened and what sort of key points were along my journey. And I found these were things that I really struggled to articulate through text and even, you know, through discourse, but doing it in an artistic way where I could sort of really, you know, channel the right brain creative side. I was able to sort of, yeah, pinpoint significant moments. But I think this is an issue. Our own ontological positioning and our relationships with others who have different ontological positionings, I think, is really important because it structures our research, it structures our interests, our research questions, the way we do data collection, the kinds of people that we develop really close relationships with, and the kind of people that we don't. And then our analysis and our thinking as we go forward. And that might seem very far away from development practice, but I think as academics, as scholars of development, I think we could be unpacking this more. Also, I've gone to 12 minutes. I've still got loads of stuff. So I will stop there and hopefully be able to cover the rest later.
Yeah, I think we'll be able to cover a lot in the Q&A as well. Okay, Matthew, over to you. I don't know how it's set up for speaking in the room.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. And before I begin to reflect on what I'm going to be talking about today, let me also say a little bit about myself. So I'm Ghanaian and a lecturer in government studies and anthropology at University of Melbourne. And I started my research work from practice, but practice as a volunteer in my community and working with different development actors who come to my village to actually have access to the community. And because I was the only one who was able to speak English, everyone would direct them to me and I served that role. So I lived daily observing how they interacted with different actors, including religious actors. Secondly, my PhD thesis and what I've been working on is on witchcraft. And the same conversation of let's dismiss it, is irrelevant, is a myth. I saw there was a relationship between witchcraft scholarship and that of religion. So I thought wise that I could actually combine the two and actually look at how both of them play out in the development sector. And lastly, a colleague of mine who studies marketing and using religion as marketing advertisement, actually we studied together, and he used to make fun of me that I studied the negative one and he studied the positive one. So the two of us decided, okay, let's do a piece together to actually see how these issues speak themselves. So we did something on Pentecostal framework and its impact on poverty reduction in Africa. So this work that I'm going to be talking about today builds on that. But before I begin to talk about what I actually found, I wanted to say that we actually seeking to advance knowledge in the religion and development sector, but through a different framework, unlike all other frameworks that we have seen in the literature. And I know there's emerging scholarship on Pentecostal framework as a framework for development, which has a different framing from the international development framing. And this particular framework we call the religious policy, right? And it's a religious policy that actually guides or directs what development look like within Pentecostal churches in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa to be precise. And what it basically says is that it promises socioeconomic development to its members through faith and sowing of seed, right? So it believes that before you can be developed, before you can have a very good well-being within the church, you first have to sow a seed, and that seed will now be used as impetus to help in your well-being. So people who actually sow a seed in the church, people who actually sow a seed in their life, and you sow a seed by being articulate of what you want, and you actually receive that. Now, if we look at it from that angle, the conversation is different. The conversation is different in a sense that from a Pentecostal point of view, and using this particular framework and how they defined poverty, how they defined wealth, is kind of different from mainstream understanding of poverty, development, and all those kind of things. And it's kind of tricky or gray area to go in a sense that, one, it defines it in religious or in spiritual sense, and at the same time in physical sense. And one of the interesting things that I like to reflect today is that it's not time bound. So even if you sow a seed and you are not receiving what you sow a seed for, you cannot say it is not working because it's not time bound. It can happen. You just have to have faith that it's going to happen. When it will happen, you don't know. And that is one of the interesting things that I want us as development scholars to look at and reflect on that. But before I get deeper into what this is all about, I wanted to talk about discursive findings within the systematic review that I did in development studies journals and cognitive journals that actually looked at religion and development. And unsurprisingly, what Olivia found or shared with us was a lot of things that I found. So I would not like to belabor those points again, but if you read broadly in the field, that is something that you'll find a lot. But one of the gaps that I realized was that most of these studies, the instrumentalist point of view, and they focus on religion from a faith-based point of view, in the sense that it did not look at it from a spiritual point of development, but still through the normative development understanding of the larger development understanding. So that was one of the things that I found. So I would say that scholarship as we have it at the moment, even though it deals with religion, but it's not totally different from mainstream understanding of religion. And that's where this study that I'm doing comes in addition to others that have been working in this area. Now, what we did first was systematic review, and we looked at development studies journals, but because of the interdisciplinarity nature of our field, the religion and development scholarship did not only find themselves in development studies journals. There were other journals that we saw a lot of things that were written about religion and development, and they were found there. But we struggled a bit when we're trying to use Google search to actually tease out that information. We realized that even though we're getting religion and development studies journal articles, they were not a lot. So we went to look at the references that people made, and that we found a lot of religion and development studies focused articles, and we used that as our analysis. So in all, we were able to tease out 170 articles that we teased out that had some tangent with religion and development. And when we reviewed the articles, we used exclusion of those that do not directly deal with development and their intersections, and we reduced it to 58. So we use 58 articles. And in the paper that we are currently writing, 42 of those articles actually feature in that. Now, what are some of the things that we wanted to talk about? First and foremost, I like the idea that we should look beyond the binary of religion matters. And this is important for me because it's not necessarily people who are religious. Those of us, or those people who are not also religious, we are all impacted by this, and we need to reflect, and that's where proportionality comes in. So for example, if we look at economic organization, especially from the Protestant or Christian framework, it is said that man or people have dominion over earth, and we have the control over other resources. So that is used as an impetus for us to be able to exploit. So religion is playing out there, even though we might not explicitly see it that way. If we also look at it from an Islamic point of view, they also have an economic paradigm that is used, or that is guided by religion. You're not supposed to make interest by a certain percentage. So we can also see that religion is also playing out there. If you go to the court settings and people are appearing before the court, you are asked to swear by what do you believe. There's Bible given to you, there's Quran given to you, and many other things. You can see that even in the legal sector, religion plays out there. The point I'm making is that when we want to look at religion and development, it's not necessarily the people who are religious, even those of us who are not religious, it still has an impact. And we need to question some of the moral judgment where it comes from. And you can trace everything to our region orientation. Another thing I wanted to also say is that if you look at the welfare state in most places, both developed and the developing world, it has its source in altruistic nature of what? Religion, right? So it's important that when we are talking about religion and development, it's a bigger one, and all of us are impacted by that at the micro level, meso level, and macro level. And that's why we need to be concerned, or we need to relook at religion in that sense. But I'm focusing, after giving this broader context, I'm focusing on Pentecostal framework. And what does this Pentecostal framework say? As I mentioned, it reframes its understanding of what poverty is. And if you look at the traditional churches such as Roman Catholic and all the kind of things, they actually glorify poverty, and there are biblical support to say that the poor would have access to the kingdom of God and all this kind of stuff. But if you look at the Pentecostal framework, it actually does not glorify poverty, and actually sees people who are poor as sin, because you are sinful, because you are not following the ethics of God, because you are not sowing a seed. That is why you are in that position. So that's a different framing. And with that kind of framing, that's where they also conceptualize or their intervention using their religious policy, that it is only those who have faith, it is only those who sow seed that will be able to get wealthy, that will be able to live out of their poverty situation and be able to make it. So what I know time is of essence here, and we would actually have time to reflect. But a key takeaway I wanted to reflect today in this paper is that, and I'm still writing, and I'm keen to hear other perspectives that can help me make this paper better, is that the Pentecostal framework is not a development approach that's currently in partnership with international development organizations. It's solely within the church. And it's difficult at the moment, and I don't know what proposition will you give to that, because how do you go to the church to partner with this kind of framework that does not agree with our understanding of what poverty is, what wealth is, and even the way they actually reorient and that kind of understanding. So it will be very important for us to really look at how we engage in that area. And that is important because the rate at which religion, and especially this Pentecostal framework, is growing in Africa is high. And there's no any evidence that it's going to go down. If you look at all the denomination, you can actually see that this Pentecostal framework, the Pentecostals, is actually on the rise. And we need to dig deeper to understand its place in development, whether in the spiritual realm, economic realm, or socio-economic well-being. So I will leave it here, and during other questions, I will have a lot more to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and I mean, this is the ontology's point as well. How do we come from these very, very different perspectives and bring them together in something that makes sense? Maybe we don't. Okay, Selena, over to you.
So I feel like everyone's having a really strong meta reflection, and I'm like, oh, I was just going to talk about violence against children and faith, but maybe it's good to end with a very concrete topic, as maybe an example of some of those wider binaries and ontologies and all of those sorts of things. So I'm really interested to get into that conversation with you. So I'm going to try and keep my little example, you know, maybe relatively short, and maybe just to start with positionality. It's so interesting being in these kinds of global forums and thinking about, well, what is the global conversation? Because I work so concretely often in spaces where religion does have a lot of power, in the field, in countries. I'm based here in South Africa. I'm affiliated with the Unit for Religion and Development Research, but I also work independently. But we're situated within a theological faculty. So I have a lot of exposure to, we work interdisciplinary, we work interfaith, but I'm based on the African continent, and I'm working in many global South contexts, and it's not only the global South where religion has power, where religion has enormous power in the lived experiences and lived realities of people. So I'm aware, because I work in those spaces, the university, wider university with its secular bias. I have training as a social scientist, so I kind of see all of that side. But I'm also trained as a theologian. I'm a faith leader myself. So I kind of also see that other side when you're in spaces, often in local community spaces where religion has enormous power, and not only instrumental power at the service of development, but you know, inherent power in people's lives. And I work across a number of forms of violence, queer violence, gender-based violence, violence against children, violence around disability. So when I come to this kind of particular issue, I come wearing these many hats, and maybe very aware that whilst in certain settings, we're sort of, like Olivia was saying, sort of trying to get religion a place at the table and a voice, in other settings, this notion of secularity is completely absent, right? You have to talk religion, and religion is a very complex and not a homogenous thing at all. As Matthew was saying, the theological frames that are used by different denominations in different spaces are extremely diverse and very complex. And I want to kind of use that as my way into, obviously, this particular piece of work that I did for JLI, and my around ending violence against children and faith. Because I think a really big thing that came out of this piece of research is this notion of a mixed blessing, that religion is already present and is doing a lot of good. Often that's not documented, but there's also this other side of ways in which it's doing harm. And often those conversations take place separately from each other. We see, you know, people of faith, you know, in a sense trying to advocate, but we're doing good things and we're playing a positive role, and we want to voice a place at the table. And we see a maybe sensationalized negative narrative that comes in secular space about all the problems that religion creates. And we saw this, in fact, in the literature. We saw a lot of grey literature from faith-based organizations, primarily international actors who maybe have the ability to write things up. Very sort of focus on the positive, look at the things that we're doing, look at the programs we're running. And I think it's important when we look at something like children, there's huge possibilities there. Children play an important role in the majority of faith traditions. You know, they're seen historically as a blessing from the divine, and families are often a real building block. So there's a really nice potential and real connection that kind of happens between faith and children. And there's been a long history of that kind of work. But at the same time, there are a number of areas, and maybe we see the literature starting to speak more about these areas, where religion and faith has done harm. So we can think particularly about something like violent discipline or corporal punishment. But we can also see, especially in recent literature, scandals around child sexual abuse, and a silencing maybe from within religions around that issue, and maybe at times a sensationalization of that particular issue from the outside. So it's how do we, as religion and development scholars and practitioners and researchers, hold on to these ambiguities, right? That religion isn't just one thing, and in relation to all these different issues, religion can play a lot of different roles, and how do we amplify those positive roles, but how do we also, as scholars in this space, find ways to deal with the complexity of the ways in which religion can do harm. And one of the big things that came out of this piece of work, and Olivia's alluded to it, and I'm really aware that many of you are also working on these issues, so I speak only from my context, is this risk of instrumentalization. So when you come from the lens of academia and development studies, religion is often then spoke about in instrumentalized ways. Ironically, when you come from the other end, from the theological, from within churches, it's the other way round. That religion is the truth, and everything, and development and child rights can only fit into that narrative to the extent that it uses that language. So I think there's a really interesting possibility that needs further thought and reflection around this notion of spiritual capital, that religions do hold power in the field where supposedly secular, whatever that means, actors are working, and the question is not to argue too much about do they have power or not, but given that there is power, how is that power being used? How is it being deployed? How can it be accelerated to collaborate for the benefit of these different populations we work with, and not to their, to their disadvantage? And my sense is this requires, a level of humility from all of the different actors in the situation. As a faith actor myself, as well as sort of a scholar, I try to speak very critically and position myself as someone from within that space. As a Christian faith leader, how do I grapple with some of the ways in which my tradition has done harm? But how do I not get so caught up in that I fail to recognize the evidence of all of the good that is being done? And I think what hit us as we looked at the literature, and we looked at sort of 172 different sources, that there was a lot of grey literature. There was a huge amount, and then there was a lot of projects that were amazing projects but hadn't been written up in any kind of way at all. And I think this is the challenge when we start to talk, as we know, about evidence. That the faith sector is often undocumented. There's often so much happening informally. And when it is documented, it's often documented in grey literature, maybe by the organisation themselves, with a very particular slant, often geared towards fundraising for those projects, understandably. But it can mean that all of that body of evidence doesn't make it into the academic canon. And this, of course, is not entirely true. There is increasing work that is being done. But how do we bridge that gap where we actually document local contexts and local practitioners of the things that they're doing? The second thing that was interesting for us, so we were sort of saying, we need more documentation of that positive body that is being done around children. But we also need this critical lens. There's been increased focus around things like violent discipline and child sexual abuse. Those were two of the really big things that kind of emerged as like, these are areas that need more detailed attention. And a rising interest around child rights. I can't tell you, in the conversations I've had, I come as a practitioner, so I've come into research more intentionally than the last 10 years. But because my background is in human rights, and then my PhD was in the connection between theology and human rights, child rights in particular, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with faith leaders who say to me, no, but we don't do child rights because it's a secular idea. We're religious. And so many of those conversations are about, well, how do you reclaim a long religious history of engagement around human rights? And that's often a real shock to ordinary religious people, because they have been presented with this binary and they've rejected a lot of things. And I think on both sides, there's those rejections going on, which limit the kind of conversations that need to be happening for children's lives to be changed. So I found studies like the Aragata International study in 2019. So looking at how do you embed child rights across all of the different faith traditions as really important bridges for moving forwards. How do we not get stuck on, well, who owns the language of child rights, but how do we actually build multi-source collaborations? And, we see this in interfaith work as well. So this notion of sort of working together for children, how can we build commonalities? My sense, though, relatively strongly, and I must keep an eye on time, my sense, particularly in children's work, is we cannot shy away from the difficult areas. So, there's a range of difficult areas, corporal punishment being one, or violent discipline, LGBT, so children of diverse sexual and gender identity, the need for a sort of gendered lens and various taboos around issues, such as child marriage, interestingly, Matthew, witchcraft, and sort of faith-related beliefs that lead to various practices of child abuse. These are often incredibly taboo subjects in religious communities. And while there's been a proliferation of literature around sort of child sexual abuse within the Catholic Church in particular, in the study that we did, which was interfaith, people from a wide variety of faiths said this is an issue in our community, but it's not being talked about. It's not being outed in the same way, but it's there. So it seems to me that we need to build on some of the existing good work and the evidence that's there, and be unashamed about the fact that there is a huge amount of work that's being done by faith. But at the same time, we need to build bridges to be able to talk about some of the ways in which different theologies and different faith perspectives, that spiritual capital, has been misused and doesn't have to be misused and needs to be transformed. And I've felt really encouraged over the last 5 years seeing more work being done on those issues, seeing those topics being spoken about. I think there's still more to be done. There are still certain children and certain issues that get prioritized, and other issues that kind of still get silenced and ignored. I'm doing quite a lot of work around disability at the moment. And one of the massive issues that's coming up is the different theologies or faith-related beliefs about disability and healing, which have a huge impact on children with disabilities. But at the same time, you've got amazing faith-based organizations very committed to working on disability. So this notion of the instrumentalization, where we do activities, but we don't always interrogate, well, are there life-giving theologies and beliefs that we can nurture, or are there harmful ones that need to be deconstructed? And I think this is a huge role that the religion and development space can play, of being willing to open that box in relation to those different issues, and being willing to bring different people to the table. Witchcraft was an incredibly taboo topic, and digital violence against children is an emerging area that we need to spend more attention on, but sort of isn't being talked about in church context, in mosque context, in temple contexts. Maybe the biggest thing for me, and this spans across almost all of the work that I do a lot of work around gender issues, and sort of this hierarchy often ordained by religion of men first, women second. And I'm not by any way saying that that's what all religious people think. I'm saying it's a very entrenched traditional view that is present in a lot of the communities I work in. We see a similar thing around children. In a way, nobody advocates violence against children. You're not going to go in and have people go, oh, I think we should be violent towards children. But there's so many forms of hidden violence. And there's so many ways in which certain kinds of violence are normalized so they're not seen as violence. And much of this comes down to how is the family being positioned? Is it positioned as a hierarchy where children inhabit a space where the patriarch rules? Or are children given a space where they can be both seen and heard? So child participation came up as incredibly important in as a solution moving forwards. And it was really interesting to talk to religious people who had very different views on this. There was a recognition that historically children have often been unseen and unheard, and kind of seen as inferior, even in church and temple and synagogue contexts. But at the same time, there was a recognition that there are incredible resources within religious traditions for centering children. So in the tradition I'm from, the attitude of Jesus towards children, the way in which Jesus behaved, and the ability to kind of draw on these spiritual resources and belief systems to actually accelerate change. And I suppose I'm ending with that point from Olivia about, instrumentalization takes us so far, and I'm not in any way saying that the instrumentalized use of faith community shouldn't kind of continue and be used, that social capital, that access capital that exists. But what I'm finding, and I'm doing a lot of work with the United Nations at the moment, is being able to talk in so-called secular spaces about spiritual capital and what that means, and belief systems, and why we need to talk about them, is gathering currency. And that's leading to really interesting conversations. And as someone who thinks if we're going to change a lot of the violence patterns we see, violence against children, violence against queer people, violence against disabilities, violence against women, we have to go deeper into our traditions of belief. And that also involves our positionality, where we speak. And it's also, I think, getting beyond the binary that religious people have beliefs and secular people don't have beliefs. We all have beliefs. And I think the ability to bring those beliefs and values to the table and talk about them is a real area where the religion and development space enables that conversation in relation to all the issues we work in. And I think that is an incredibly important thing for change in the world. And I think particularly in the area of ending violence against children, that we talk about how our beliefs affect children. I think I'm probably super over my time, so
yes, so we may just move on, Selena. Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh no, don't worry. But we're at a good point. So thank you. That was great. Emma, I'll put the slide up, but then over to you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, for a fascinating discussion so far. I mean, I'd like to kind of launch in myself with my own thoughts and reflections, but I'm going to stick to the plan. We suggested some questions which, to save some time, I've sort of now clustered in my mind into three different types, and I'm going to sort of ask each of you to speak to the three topics for a couple of minutes. So I think the first three questions probably fit within a broader category of where have we got to and where are we going. So what's the state of the art in our field? What's the most cutting edge research? What topics in religion and development have seen the most significant growth and improvement, for instance, over the last 5 years, and where do we still need more work to take place? And I know a number of you have touched on that in your talks already, but there might be some other areas that you just want to build on and develop for a couple of minutes. Then I'm going to ask a question about, you know, does religions and development actually comprise a field in itself? You know, is there enough research going on and enough researchers in the area to count as its own field or discipline? You know, should we be doing more to think about what we're doing as a field? And finally, a question about sort of bridging the gap, which I know all of us want to do. We want the academic research to feed into practice and to be transformative and to make a difference. So how do we represent the evidence base to policymakers and practitioners? You know, what are we doing well? Where are people getting the right message? And where are there still inconsistencies and misconceptions? And do we need to rethink about how we package the research or the kind of research we do in order to be more transformative? So, you know, where have we got to and where are we going? So, Annika, you've not had a chance to talk for a while. You were at the beginning before. So would you like to start now? So where have we got to and where are we going?
Big questions. And I want to rebound. I don't want to miss the opportunity. I want to answer the questions, but in a way that I take the opportunity to speak to all this insight from the other contributors. Yeah, Matthew and Selena, the thing about witchcraft, I'm really glad you mentioned this because I've come across it in so many contexts, different contexts, shaping so many development issues. And I really have struggled to find anything written about it in concrete terms, whether empirical studies, its implications for our conceptual frameworks, or its implications for practice. So in terms of, you know, where might be the gaps, maybe that sort of answers that question. But so for instance, I was in a training just the other day that was a training on sexual harassment for African academics who are on a fellowship program in Belgium. And it was the facilitator actually explained that she had a colleague who had told her, you know, who clearly had, you know, romantic intentions towards her and it was uncomfortable, had said that he'd been to see, you know, a witch doctor who had told him that she was going to have his baby. And she explained this as an example of sexual harassment. And she was so uncomfortable and terrified by this situation. And she said, I've never spoken about this. This is the first space where I've actually spoken about this incident. And it made me think that, well, first of all, in all our ways of talking about sexual harassment, we'd given this whole list of what counts as sexual harassment, but we'd never considered, you know, spiritual attacks as examples. You know, the threat of witchcraft or the actual practice of witchcraft as a form of sexual harassment or sexual violence was just completely outside our frame. But then also, how do you address that in practical terms? I was thinking, having access to protection ought to be part of, in our framework of the kinds of resources one needs in order to be able to exercise agency towards empowerment. So it was like, but also in practical terms, how do we talk about these things and how do we address them? So it's really important to have these conversations to say, what are we missing? Because we're thinking in certain terms. And I want to say, what was it? Yeah, all these examples, Selena, that you're giving of these bridges, but also the conversations, because bridges are relationships, right? But it's the conversations that we're having in the context of those relationships. And I wanted to say, so this is in relation to the question about the evidence base. And I've been thinking a lot about this relationship. You know, it's the old chestnut question, right, of the relationship between evidence and policy and practice that affects all of us. And the way the question was framed, I feel it kind of reflects a bit of an assumption of a linear relationship, that we can just put evidence or information out there and then policymakers or practitioners will pick it up, and we hope that they pick it up in the right ways that we want them to. When I think really productive relationships between evidence and policymaking happen, and there is literature on this, that we need to be creating, maybe we need to be thinking in different ways. We need to be thinking not so much in terms of putting evidence out there, but more in terms of creating spaces and building bridges and facilitating dialogues on these tricky issues. And obviously making those spaces really egalitarian in terms of ontologies of these, I suppose, powerful stakeholders. So your development actors, your donors, and then your, Selena, you know, your faith leaders, say. But the third party is the people who are going to be affected by these programs and policies, who sort of disappeared sometimes from the discussion. So are we creating spaces to discuss problems where we're each bringing our own contributions and our own experiences, but also the more marginalized people, their priorities? If we're creating spaces where those dialogues can happen over a sustained period of time, that's how we'll develop policies and programs that are likely to address these issues. So I think we need to be thinking about not just evidence, but evidence in the context of those relationships. If that answers that question.
Thanks so much, Annika. I suggest actually that each of you does just address the three topics in your feedback, because otherwise, or whatever one you want to address, because we're not going to have time, I don't think, to go through all the topics otherwise. Selena, I'm going to ask you if you want to respond next. Annika was sort of relating her comments to a large degree to some of the things that you were saying, so I thought you might like a chance to respond and to address the questions. We can't quite hear you. I don't know what's happened. We could hear you perfectly before.
Can you hear me now?
You've got not very clearly. No, it's very, very distorted.
Change anything.
You're fine now.
Okay, all right. Okay. It's so hard. I think you want to have a chat with what someone's saying. So I understand about sticking to the questions. I think the only thing I want to say with Annika's point there is one of the things we found really effective is supporting what's called practice-based knowledge. So we've done a whole series over 3 years with the United Nations Women around practitioner-based knowledge. So centering the voices of practitioners in the creation of research. And you kind of think, well, this has always been done, but it's so interesting. In policy documents, this doesn't always happen. So I think instead of having this linear thing of we build evidence and then we get research and then we try and get it out to policymakers and down to practitioners, I find that centering the voices of practitioners really directly in the research is this almost way of saying, when you talk to practitioners, they want to talk about religion because it's affecting their lives. And that becomes this alternative way to enable religion to speak with sort of authority, right? And it sort of messes with that idea of like, you know, do we start with practice or do we end with practice? So there's just a thing there for me about methodologies. And Annika, you were saying, how do we talk about these things? And I'm always struck in trainings, you know, where where there's so often you talk about a sort of a topic like sexual harassment, but religion is left outside the door, and people's religious experiences or belief-related experiences don't come into that conversation. So I have found that this sort of state of the art, where we're starting to have those kinds of transformative methodologies being used in research workshops, being used in conferences, being used in the development of materials. This idea that you open the methodology up so that religious beliefs and cultural beliefs become part of that conversation, and become part of the research. And I think this is really promising. So it's not sort of shaving religion down so that it can fit into this particular academic way of seeing the world. It's breaking open the academic world to recognize the lived reality of religion. And this for me is, I think, really promising. I think the other area, and in a sense, it's not so much topics, it's about ways of thinking. So when I don't sort of think, oh, there's a list of topics. I mean, I do think that, but I actually think the most important thing is to think about how are we thinking about all of the topics. So for me, there's the going deeper, looking at social norms. So rather than a long list of extra topics that we need, it's saying, well, what are the cross-cutting issues? So social norms affects how we see children, how we see women, how we see disability, and an ability to say religion has a role to play around social norms and beliefs is actually a really important role. And once we go down that level, we're having a different kind of conversation. I also think this is where you see intersections. So intersectionality and interdisciplinarity are both really important features of the work that I do. But I think that once you're able, not in a trendy, this is the new buzzword kind of thing, when you're able to help people see how things connect together. This, how I treat my wife influences how I treat my children, influences how I think about my family. So we don't silo off into smaller and smaller little sections with our research, but we start to say, how do we see how things connect? And this for me is really promising. And I think it offers a new way for religion to engage, like you were saying, Annika, not a religion and development, but what are the existing interconnections where religion interfaces with development already, and it's already present, and we're not arguing for it, but we're saying, how do we interrogate those interfaces? And some of them are positive and some of them are harmful, but they're not fixed. They're not fixed, they're not static, they're not homogenous. So we can have this evolving conversation. And for me, this enables a new lens on the topics that we've already been working on. I don't think it's about adding new topics in. I think it's about how do we approach these topics differently. And I think I'm going to stop there because that's those sort of three questions. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Selina. Matthew, do we still have you in the room there? It'd be great to hear your thoughts on these questions.
I'm here. Thank you very much.
Hello.
I think for us to be having this conversation means that religion in development or in development are very important. And one of the things I wanted to start off with is that I was very excited when I chanced on Olivia's paper that she presented today. And I think that it benchmarked where we have come from and where we are and where we should be going in the future. And I think that already sets the agenda. In addition to that, a lot of things that we are all reflecting today and wondering about also gives us direction as to where we should be going. And I do know that we are not the only religious and development studies college. There are others out there. And all the important conversations they are having, they are struggling with. That means that those are the new areas that we should be looking at how to address those questions that we are confronted with, but not knowing what to do with it, especially when there are different epistemological backgrounds or ontologies. You are coming from somewhere, you are dealing with an issue that is directly opposite. What do you do with it? How do you engage with that? So I think those challenges would force us to think about new ways of advancing scholarship in this area. One of the things I wanted to say, especially with regards to whether we need to have a new field or whether we qualify as a discipline or a sub-discipline, is I'm really struggling with that. One, and that is basically because development studies as a whole is an interdisciplinary, and we pick from different, or we have people theorize not necessarily based in development, but engaging in a lot of important development studies work. And when I was doing this systematic review, I equally found that there were a lot of people who were doing works that are related to development and religion, but not necessarily situated in development studies. So do we want to open up and engage in interdisciplinarity studies, collaborations, partnerships, or do we want to consign ourselves into a specific niche field to say that this is development and religion studies? And so I guess that's where I'm a little bit confused, and I don't know the direction to take. I'm hoping that someone will help me here.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Olivia, I'll turn to you now.
Yes, I think I would agree, Matthew, is actually it doesn't really serve us to put ourselves in a corner, so to speak. And we are very interdisciplinary, but that's sometimes where it can be frustrating as well, because it means that you have to know a little bit of every discipline. And it sometimes feels like every discipline under the sun. And so it can feel a bit that you're pushed and pulled in lots of different directions. I want to speak about the evidence-based thing mainly. And if you'll allow me, I'll use an example from a completely different area. So I've had a baby this year, last year. And when I was pregnant, I got into all this idea of this evidence-based birth literature. And there's someone called Emily Oster, who's a professor at Brown, who's very popular about it. And she summarizes like the latest research in an area to say, they did a clinical trial and they found that this medicine definitively helps preeclampsia or something. And it's very popular. There's this evidence-based birth trend. And so I really got into it, of course, as a researcher. I was like, great. But I started to think, well, can we do this as well for, our religion and development work? Say, there's this new piece of research that's come out, like, why haven't we been able to do that? And the problem is because we just can't do clinical trials on this topic, basically. We are not going to find the one medicine that is the cure for this particular thing. We have been, I think the evidence kind of debates and expectations in the development world have pushed us in the direction of feeling that we need to provide this one statistic that proves that that if you work with religion in this one way, you will cure this particular problem. And even saying it, of course, that is ridiculous. So we are, we need to, again, basically open people's understanding of their positionality and their ontological understandings to understand that there is not going to be this one statistic, or they cannot put religion in this one box or this one corner. But that is sometimes what we're working against, is that expectation. So that's kind of what actually at JLI we end up working on almost on a daily basis, even if it's kind of unspoken, but it's what makes the work so difficult. And so Annika, yes, I do completely agree. These discussion spaces basically for people to engage with. What we found over the years is it's not just presenting the evidence, like this one piece of research says. We can present, yes, the research is saying this and this, and the complexity of this picture, and what is your personal experience? How do you engage with this? Do you think, does this ring true to how you work in your workplace or your life experiences? Let's bring the evidence together with your experiences, and very importantly, your spiritual take on this. What is your spiritual background? How is that influencing your ideas about this topic? And so only with the combination of those three areas, which let's say is like the evidence, the technical, the research, the personal experience, and then the spiritual and theological, that's the combination you need. And having any one of those areas only does not lead to, the outcomes that we're trying to see, the engagement that we really want with all this. So And maybe, Emma, we should also hear from the room as well. I'm aware of that, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Olivia and everyone else. I mean, you know, one thing I just wanted to sort of emphasize as well is in terms of the evidence, when we're presenting, and I think this room might be an example of this, when we're presenting and discussing our evidence, it's often to people who already buy into the idea that religion matters and that it's important and that it's something that needs to be taken seriously in development and humanitarianism. And it's very, very difficult in development environments to get the interest of the broader audience and of the so-called secular organizations who we're actually trying to influence and to have a debate and a dialogue with. So there's always this tension, I think, in the religion and development field. So maybe we are a field, but, you know, not really one that is often as integrated into the other disciplines that it draws upon in a very practical way. Yeah, I mean, I would be very happy. Oh yes, we've got people in the room, and we've also got one person on the call as well. So very, very happy to take any other questions or comments or feedback, either from the people in the room or the or other people on the call.
I'm not sure if you can see my hand, so maybe
I couldn't. I was wondering how I was going to do this, but please do go ahead, please.
That's on the beach. Hi, I'm Mike Jennings.
Hi, Mike.
From SOAS. So, I mean, people were talking how long they've worked in this field, and I was reflecting. I did my master's dissertation looking at history of religion and development almost 30 years ago. More than my fair share of some of the approaches that have been quite rightly critiqued, and I'm in the middle of writing another one. But so it's a really interesting conversation on all sides. Lots to say. I'll just limit myself to one point, which is, you know, I wonder if one way to kind of start reframing what we do, not separately for the other things or instead of, but as well as, is to start thinking about the place of values and ideas in development more widely. One of the things that, you know, faith actors or religious actors and faith actors are seen as outliers because they're so overt that they're based upon a value system. But the idea that other organizations are not is a complete nonsense, of course. So, you know, to maybe refine Ferguson's idea, you know, development is not just an anti-politics machine, it's an anti-ideas machine. And maybe by looking at that more widely, we can start to think about or breaking down that, you know, unreal divide between secular and binary. So, for example, if you're looking at, I don't know, World Vision, we all know kind of their theology, we know their positions. But how many people, when they're looking at Oxfam, say, well, of course, you know, your Fabianism kind of bundled up into a brick building. And if you don't understand that, how can you possibly understand what Oxfam's programs were trying to do? And so we kind of completely remove that. And that also draws attention to the fact that institutions are comprised of people, and it's the people who are writing the policies and approaches. So if we don't understand their values, we don't listen to their worldviews, their philosophies, we miss an awful lot of this. And, you know, all of us who teach will have experience of this. When you talk to students about why they are doing development, you know, very few of them come with kind of anything that would be kind of fit comfortably. You know, of course, you get your kind of rational economic Marxists, but you get a huge amount of people who are coming with these kind of ideas and beliefs and value systems. And I think if we could focus on that, that might well make it easier. And I suppose that also speaks to the thing on positionality that you spoke about, Annika. So you said that, you know, we're often asked to position ourselves sociologically, but not from a faith perspective. And I partially agree with that. What I would say is that I have never in my life of talking, of teaching, ever been asked about my value system, except when I talk about faith. If I talk about faith, someone will always ask what my faith is, do I have any, because that will clearly influence my or, you know, create subjectivity. No one asks if I'm a socialist, if I'm a neoliberal, if I belong to a political party, if I, you know, whatever other values I have, even though that is just as important for understanding what it is. So there is something different that I think you get when you work on faith and religion, and that it's hugely complicated about positionality. And I think we face more pressure to kind of speak about that than we should do in others if we think about values. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mike. Any more questions in the room there?
Yeah, I think I'm not even in the screen now.
Oh, hello. You weren't in the
I'm moving
screen.
here.
Go ahead.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Emanuele Fantini and I work at the Institute for Water Education. I just realized that I have a friend and colleague in common with Mike, because before preaching in the Church of Water, I've been studying the Ethiopian Pentecostal movement with Jörg Hausten.
Oh.
And their role in development in Ethiopia. I have a few, first I would like to say something on evidence, also related to our positionality. So my position is that my background is political science. I've been trained as a political scientist. I'm from Italy, so I also have a Catholic background. I'm a sinner in both fields, both political science and Catholic. Evidence. I think there is an interesting friction when we bring this idea of evidence-based and religious studies. Also, if we think about the very etymology of evidence, which comes from the Latin looking from outside, seeing from outside, and all your presentation clearly shows how our paths are crossing across practice, theology, academia. So I find it very difficult to place myself outside and look from outside at this. And I learned another thing that which is about interdisciplinarity, how religion and religious studies are perceived and looked from outside, from the disciplines they're bringing those evidence. I'm working with hydrologists, with water engineers, and we in a master program, which is an interdisciplinary master program called Water and Sustainable Development. This year, a colleague came with the idea of introducing a short course, elective on spiritual ecology. And there were very interesting, but also quite harsh discussion with colleagues that are ignorant, and not because it's their fault, but because there are many disciplines that we are ignorant about engineers. So they're ignorant about religious studies, and they barely see the difference between religion and religious studies. So we're not there yet. And so I'm interested in your idea of building bridges. And if you have also practical ideas on how to build bridges with other disciplines, with the practitioner that also we find, and with the disciplines that whose practice we found in the field. And I really appreciate what Mike just said about values, because our strategy has been to reframe this spiritual ecology module in our master exactly in the broader and perhaps more neutral terms of water cultures, values, and knowledge, and to really be more diverse, plural. I think that's for me a way of bridging, but perhaps you have more practical and original ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much. We're probably going to have to draw this to a close because I think they've finished these. We will get kicked out pretty brutally at 1/2 if yesterday's experience is anything to go by. I mean, I don't know if anyone's got a pressing final point that they'd like to make. I mean, I think this has been absolutely fascinating, you know, and been really important to have so many, you know, very experienced people who have been working in the field for a long time to comment on this topic, as well as others who are perhaps newer to the field. And, you know, perhaps this suggest to us as the study group at the DSA on religion and international development that, you know, it might be good to try and have a follow-up meeting perhaps at some point next year, either in person or online. Online might be better, or maybe even hybrid, to kind of push these discussions forward a little bit more, because I think we do have a field, but what it consists of and how well it connects with other disciplines and with practitioners is something that, you know, we still need a lot more discussion and debate on. So I'm going to sort of hold that thought there and see if we can sort of pull together another meeting for later in the year. Does anyone want to finish with a final point? We've got a couple of minutes left. Selina, please go ahead.
I think this is the notion that our beliefs matter, you know, and including values in that. And I think just being able to bring that as people into all the spaces we go into, whatever discipline, like as an academic, in academic spaces, I try to bring who I am into that, and in secular spaces to speak about being a faith leader. And I think there's something transgressive about methodologies that enable us to embody, you know, that push away from this narrowing of the evidence base down into sort of kind of economic neoliberal, if you can't count it, it doesn't matter type stuff. And there are many allies which we will find along the way when we do that, because this narrowing of the evidence base actually takes away people, you know, we start going, well, people's life experience isn't part of evidence. You know, we narrow it to this notion of seeing from the outside is the only way to do evidence. And that's a very public health lens, and there's a place for it, but there's a place for it. It's not a ladder where that sits at the top and dictates everything else. So I just think there's so much interesting work that can be done methodologically, where as scholars that say we center beliefs and values and those things, we have something incredibly important to offer other disciplines where those are an influence, but it's often not recognized. So yeah, that's my maybe tip for that, building bridges, like bring that and bring that with confidence. You know, actually we need to talk about these things are shaping people's lives, and development's supposed to be about shaping people's lives. Yeah.
Perfect finishing point, Selina. Thank you so much, and thanks to the other presenters as well, and to Olivia for doing the organising of this panel too, and thanks to the other participants in the audience as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.